Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and we're going to have some fun today. Yesterday, I put out a teaser video asking the question whether Dan Worrall has convinced me with his arguments about dynamics versus loudness. And this video is essentially the part 2 to that one. I'm going to answer that question. If you're not familiar and if you didn't watch this video, a few months ago, Dan put out a video where he ranted a little bit about DJs and their preference for loud masters and his opinion of that, which I won't necessarily reiterate. And some producers tried to, argue their points. Producer DJs, I should say, tried to argue their points in the comment thread. And Dan still held fast for the most part. I know of at least one producer DJ from Hong Kong who has a pretty good channel called Tutorialism. And he tried to directly, talk heart to heart with Dan, and Dan still, engaged him, but still kind of held fast a little bit to his opinions and arguments so far. And so this particular video is going to be my attempt at answering the question. And this is partly for Dan's sake, but mostly for your sakes as bystanders in the conversation. I mean, Dan is very respectable. I respect Dan a lot. I take Dan's opinion to heart. And, I wanted to check some of my own assumptions. It's always good to be in a learning mode. You never stop learning as a producer. So what I did was I wrote a track specifically to test Dan's assertions and to, double check my own assumptions. Basically, this is a song that I knew would highlight the issues at the core of the debate in the DJ world about loud, hot, saturated mixes versus quieter, more dynamic, more punchy mixes. This song was written from scratch to demonstrate and highlight both approaches and what it sounds like in the context of a DJ environment, for one, mostly. So let's talk a little bit about this track, and I'm going to play it for you in a second if you haven't already seen the first video. This is a chill, down-tempo kind of track. It's meant to be used as a chill-out song in a mix. Every DJ, you can't keep the energy high all the time, or the bar will not hire you back, right? Because they want you to send people to the bar to get drinks. So, that, and people get tired and get a little burnt out and need a rest anyway if they've been really vibing to some heavy, heavy music. So you need to throw in songs in your set that chill the crowd out, make them get off the dance floor, make them go relax, go to the bathroom, buy drinks, whatever. And that's what this kind of song is. But it still has to fit in the overall vibe of your set. And I, in particular, I'm a producer and a DJ. I write a lot of my own stuff, and I like and play what we would broadly call festival-oriented bass-heavy music. Festival-oriented bass music. Very high energy, very aggressive. It includes the genres like trap, dubstep, mid-tempo bass, rhythm, left field bass, other things that are all heavy, drum and bass, right? Stuff like that. And that's a very aggressive and high energy kind of music with a lot of sub bass, right? You're there to rattle the air in people's lungs and just make their whole, their brain and body vibrate. And that's a challenging kind of music to get loud. That's one of the reasons I do these videos. All that sub bass energy makes it really difficult to get the kind of density and loudness and heat that all these producers and DJs tend to prefer, all right? Now, a chill out track is kind of tough to fit into that kind of set because it needs to be down tempo and mellow, yet it still needs to have a lot of sub bass And most importantly, because it's kind of chill out, it needs to have a vibe and a groove that requires a punchy kind of drum beat to carry the song, okay? So this is a really good test of dynamics, more dynamics versus less dynamics, and what effect that has on a song like this. The other thing about this song in particular, it's heavy in the sub bass because it's meant to go with this genre of music. And specifically, I've written it in the one of the impossible keys for sub heavy music. There's a saying, a common bit of wisdom / advice that's passed around to newer producers in these genres, saying you really shouldn't make a song any lower than the key of F. Maybe if you're really good, you can go down to the key of E. Maybe even E flat if you're really good. But honestly, at first, don't try to go any lower than F. F is the perfect key to do a bass heavy dubstep or whatever song in, right? And there's some truth to that because even though a lot of subwoofers, even big array, like big subwoofers like you'd find at clubs, but certainly those 8-inch monitors on your desk or even that 10-inch subwoofer under your desk, even though their spectral specifications will say that they go down to 30 hertz or even 20 hertz, they don't really. If you look at the frequency response charts for even the big, like the PK subs and so on and so forth, you'll see that a roll-off starts happening somewhere around the 40 hertz range. And so by the time you get below 40 hertz, you're losing as much as like 3 dB of power or more, 6 dB of power. Like it really falls off quickly after somewhere in the low 40s. And so that's why the key of F is so easy. F is at 43.7 hertz. And F sits pretty much right at that point before the roll-off, the real true roll-off that all these subs have, right? You get lower than F and now you're in that roll-off territory and they're losing a lot of power. So you have to crank even more power to a song that's in something like the key of D. To make that D as loud as an F, you have to push a lot more power into that sub. And the more power you have to push, the harder and more unwieldy your mix gets because now there's so much energy in the sub range and your limiter's hitting that and whacking it down and making it sound bad and, blah, blah, blah. So theoretically, this is a song in an impossible key because I wrote this in D, okay? You can make songs, sub-heavy songs in C and D, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. There's just a trick to doing it. So this is just a really good song to test Dan's arguments versus mine. And the whole point of this video is to show you, I'm going to be demonstrating, some mixes using Dan's approach versus my approach, 2 different levels of dynamics. And you can judge for yourself. Consider Dan's arguments, consider mine, make your own decision. All right, that's all this video is for. So specifically in this video, I'm going to cover the following things. The first thing I'm going to do, because it's the thing you're all here for, most of you, I'm going to use these 4 comparison tracks that clearly demonstrate the end result of Dan's arguments for more dynamics versus my previous, up to today, arguments for less dynamics. Will I still hold to my arguments when we're done? Hang in here and find out. The next thing I'm going to do is explain another legitimate argument for less dynamics. It's not always just about what DJs want, nor is it simply a matter of taste that's, some people will say some genres just sound better squashed. Well, my question is always why? That's not good enough. Why? Why do they sound better squashed? And I think there's one other legitimate reason that I never hear anyone else really talking about, but I bring this up a lot and I'm going to reiterate it again today. Then I'm going to go into, again, focusing on these 4 demo tracks. I think these do a great job, especially when I compare them at high dynamics versus low dynamics. They do a great job of demonstrating why my clip to zero strategy, my CTZ strategy, using clip to zero in the mix and getting all your loudness in the mix, not with a mastering limiter, is going to give you vastly superior results to the conventional advice about using a limiting at the master kind of strategy. And not only does it give vastly superior results for loud music, it's superior at any level of dynamics you're shooting for. I'm going to show you why these two tracks done in a Z to Z clip to zero method sound way better than these two that are using a conventional strategy. Okay, these two tracks use my method. These two tracks use the conventional method of no clipping except at the master, where you throw everything with a really wide dynamic signal into a single mastering limiter at the end. This is going to make crystal clear my arguments all for the last year, trying to explain my gain staging and clipping strategy to y'all. So then, again, kind of as I talked about a moment ago, kind of a little bonus feature of this song is I'm going to explain to you how to pull off sub-bass heavy songs in those impossible keys of D and C. And I'm going to explain why you want to make some songs in D and C. Then I'm going to dive into, how I approach this project. I'm going to start doing some deep dive stuff, which I'm famous for. I'm going to specifically talk about something I get questions about a lot, which is how to gain stage the first primary anchor sound for your entire mix so that my C to Z approach, my clip to zero approach, will land you really close, if not exactly on your target loudness. There's a simple rule of thumb trick I use. I start every song with one sound. I set it at a certain gain staging level, and I will hit the target loudness I'm going for the genre I'm producing every time. And even if I don't exactly hit that target loudness, it's super easy. I'm going to show you how the clip to zero method makes it incredibly easy to fine adjust the loudness from there. Like super easy. Just as easy as yanking that gain or drive knob up and down on your mastering limiter. Then I'm also going to talk a little bit more in detail about how I approach mixing by setting up 3 specific framework sounds for the entire mix. I set up my anchor sound first and I gain stage it to a certain point. I set up 2 more sounds in relation to that anchor sound. And then the rest of the mix just happens by itself automatically because I'm always balancing things in that framework of 3 all-important sounds. So I'm going to cover that. And then I'm going to do a few other things as I walk through the project and just demonstrate some key mixing decisions that I think are important if your goal is a competitive loudness target in louder genres. Okay, so these are mixing decisions that help you specifically with loudness. So hang in there. Those of you who just want to see what I say about Dan, you can get out quick. Those of you who want to sit through longer deep dive and learn about some of the things I just said I was going to talk about, you can hang with me for the whole trip. Enjoy. So let us start with let's set your brain, set your mind. What is the context of this song? Okay. I didn't show it in my little teaser video, but here I'm actually going to show this song mixing out into a typical heavy song that I would, my entire playlist would be comprised of at a show. And I'm not going to tell you which of these 4 mixes I'm using for this example. I'm hiding things under the cover so you can't see that for yourself. I'm just going to let you listen to this song. It's nice and dynamic. It's punchy. And I think you're going to see that it will, in fact, successfully mix into a very low dynamics song like Teleportal by Rezz and Kotek, two of my favorite producers out there. And this song is a brilliant, brilliant reference track that I use all the time. It's probably my #1 reference track because the song's brilliant on every level, especially its engineering. This is a seriously loud song that hits about -6.1 LUFS in its loudest sections. It's a serious banger, and yet it's incredibly punchy and dynamic. Great, great, take your mind on a trip kind of song. And it's just really, really like intimidating to mix one of your own songs into a song like this, because your game's got to be on point or it's not going to work. Your song's just going to sound dead compared to this one. If you're mixing into it, or if you're mixing out of Teleportal into one of your song's going to sound wimpy by comparison if you don't do it right. So I'm going to let you see that, and I'm going to play just enough of this intro that I don't, hopefully don't get dinged by YouTube, trigger their copy protection algorithms. I can't play the whole thing for you and really go back and forth, but if you're familiar with this song, I think you'll see what I'm shooting for here. So I've got some simulated fades on here that simulate how I would actually be mixing in and out of the two songs on either side. This has a long 16-bar mix-in section and a long 16-bar mix-out section to give me plenty of headroom and runway, depending on what I'm trying to mix in and out of. So just bear with the mix-in and mix-out. Pretend it's a DJ set. And here we go. I'm going to play this for you. If you want to skip ahead, just skip ahead about 4.5 minutes. That's how long this whole thing is with the mix-in, mix-out sections. And we'll get to the direct comparison next. But first, I just want you to hear this thing end to end. Feel the journey. Feel the vibe. All right, here we go. Oops. Helps if I start from the very beginning, doesn't it? All right, sorry about that.
Could ask a million questions that would leave me wanting more. That's why I let you do the talking. Maybe that's what talking's for. I do my best to learn to listen.
All right. So if you're not familiar with teleportal, go listen to it. Go to a good source like Deezer, where you can hear it completely lossless if you can, or at least listen to it on high quality Spotify or something that isn't going to be too lossy. It's an amazing song. So let's just jump right into the comparisons now. Which one of these tracks did I use in that example? It sounded, nice and mellow and lush, plenty of roundness and presence and pop and thump to the kick and the snare. Relaxed, but still the beat was very present. So which of these do you think that song was? Well, I'll just give you the spoiler answer right now. It was the first -6 LUFS version right here, using the clip to zero method. Now what I'm going to show you should blow your mind a little bit, okay? I'm going to play this little clip. This is an export from several different projects I did. I'll explain them in a second, but first I'm just going to, well, I guess I need to explain how I did it. So here's the original song that was mastered so that this section here was hitting -6.2 LUFS. Other sections were a little quieter. I'll go over that in a minute. But what I did then was I copied the project and used one of the basic tricks of the clip to zero method, which I talked about in much more detail in this video right here that I put out just a week or so ago. Loudness is in the Mix Part 2. In this video, I talk about using this VCA group technique to pull my entire mix in and out of the clippers that are all sitting to lop off the clips right at 0 dB full scale. The whole trick to the clip to zero method is you don't dink around with pushing drive into clippers. You leave the clippers sitting at 0 so that as you push peaks up into the ceiling at 0, they get automatically clipped. And if you pull the signal down equally out of all the clippers in your cascade, then the clipping gets relaxed equally. And so it's super easy to do this. And we do this with something I call a VCA group. It's an idea we take from the analog world of mixing, where they had a special way of ganging any group of faders, any arbitrary group of faders, into one big red VCA fader. You could have 2 or 3 different VCA faders doing these arbitrary little ad hoc submixes throughout your entire console. And very few DAWs allow this. Studio One lets you do it, but you can only do it at the fader level, right? I'm using the concept of a VCA all throughout my insert channels on every single track. And I put this little VCA thing right in front of whatever device is doing the clipping at the end of the track. So right in front of the clipper, right in front of the clipper. Here, there's no clipper at the end of this specific track, but this track is part of a bus or group called the melody group. And so this signal runs directly into the clipper that's sitting on the melody group. Same for this chordal sound, right? There's no clipper on the chord track itself, but there is a clipper on the bus that this runs into. And then over here on my sub, even though it's not really getting clipped, there's a safety clipper there anyway, just in case. And so I put a VCA right in front of that and so on. So all the way up the chain, I've put these little VCAs right in front of the clippers. And then I can take those VCA things, like, if we go to this track here, this is the VCA device. I've got them all ganged to a MIDI knob, and I can literally just twist one knob on one of my external controllers and crank the volume of that signal at this specific point in the signal path through all the device inserts. I can raise or lower the volume of every one of these source sounds at the same time by the same exact amount. So that just takes the entire balanced signal and pushes it up into the clippers or down out of the clippers, right? Less dynamics if you push them into the clipper more dynamics if I pull them out of the clipper and let the peaks go even higher, right? So that's all that's going on for that. And that's how I created this 6 LUFS version versus this 11 LUFS version. All the clippers, my clipping cascade, which is part of the clip to zero method, that's still in place, but I've just relaxed the total amount of clipping so that very few things are actually getting clipped anywhere compared to this track. And I think if you listen to these 2 tracks by themselves, you're going to be surprised how little difference there is, how they're almost identical, except in a few subtle places that I'll be talking about and explain why I still prefer the less dynamic version, okay, for this context of a DJ set. Now, these other 2 tracks were done in a slightly different way. What I did there was I made yet another copy of the project. I left all the VCA levels down at that negative 11 LUFS range. So it's as if I had mixed, closer like negative 12 RMS throughout my entire mix. What would broadly equate to mixing with like a K10 kind of scale if you were using Bob Katz's K system to mix, where you mix by RMS, what he calls his K values and the K meters. Yeah, it's essentially what's going on here. So this whole thing was mixed at about 12 RMS. Left the VCAs where they sat as I pulled the signal way out of the clippers. But then I also removed all the clippers. So there's no clipper cascade anymore. Instead, everything is running into a single instance of Pro L2 at the end, which is our conventional mixing advice that everyone teaches you on YouTube. And I mean, it's been the conventional mixing advice forever. Not that many producers and engineers really talk about clipping all over the project in a very structured, gain-staged kind of way, where you have a cascade of many, many small clips that add into each other. It's a big part of what I talk about and have talked about for the last, year and a half probably. But this is the traditional way. Everything's allowed to sum up on top of each other and make these huge spiky caterpillar-like spines on the top of your waveform, big crest factor, and then you run it all into a mastering limiter. And the mastering limiter is mostly hitting about 6 dBs of gain reduction, which I see many, many well-intentioned YouTube videos say is perfectly okay. Oh, you can have up to 6 dB of gain reduction. Try not to get more than 6 dB of gain reduction. But I'm going to show you why that sounds terrible. I'm going to show you that directly. So what I've got here is a version of that project without any clippers, just using a single mastering limiter. This green one is down at 11 LUFS, right? This is what everyone's telling you to do these days when they say, oh, you should master for Spotify, which I think is total rubbish advice. But if you do follow it, if you master for Spotify or YouTube, a number I get seen thrown around a lot is go for negative 12 LUFS on your loudest section, because that's what YouTube normalizes to, and YouTube is the loudest of the normalization across all the normalized platforms. So just go for like negative 12. And this is roughly in that territory. So you're going to hear what that sounds like, where it's big dynamic range crushed into a mastering limiter at the end to catch the really high spiky caterpillar peaks that you get when you work this way. And then this negative 6 LUFS tracks is like, okay, now here's all the EDM producers who are trying to work the traditional way and then somehow magically crunch everything into a mastering limiter and get back up into like the 7 LUFS, 6 LUFS range, and what that sounds like. And you're going to see for yourself how terrible both of these sound compared to either of these dynamic range options with the clip to zero method. Okay, so I have to set that up for you so you understand what you're listening for here. And this is just a snippet of the verse, the solo, and the crescendo from the full song. So I basically clipped this, and this. It's just this thing looped over and over because they were the 3 main sections. Kind of a medium drop or a first drop, kind of a final drop, and then your lower energy intro or breakdown type sections, right? It's kind of simulating that. So Here's the fun part. First, I'm going to play you the ideal mix according to Dan Worrall. Full dynamics. Now again, this is done clip to 0, so that I'm going to mislead you a little bit, because I guarantee you this sounds way better than if you do it the real way Dan has been advising you and most of YouTube advises you. But just check this out. There's no question this is objectively the best sounding in isolation. If you were making a whole album and wanted maximum dynamics, there's no question this has a little bit, well, this has the best dynamics, okay? So let's just listen to this from end to end. Oops, helps if I start the audio engine for this one. Bitwig's great. It lets you have multiple projects open, but you still have to remember to, it can only run the audio engine for one at a time. Okay, so here we go. Again, we're listening to this blue track.
I do my best to learn to listen, since you have so much to say. If I connect with your position, I will learn so much that way.
All right, sounds good, yeah? Now, let's just squash the hell out of that all the way up to -6 LUFS. That should say -6 there, sorry. See if you hear any difference.
I do my best to learn to listen, since you have so much to say. If I connect with your position, I will learn so much that way.
All right. How much of a difference was there? 11 LUFS to 6 LUFS. That's 6 is really frickin' squashed. It's a really low dynamic range. Did the song sound less punchy to you? I imagine for most of you it sounded pretty much the same. There are subtle differences for sure. And I would argue that in some ways the -6 LUFS version actually sounds psychoacoustically to your brain a bit more punchy, a bit more forward, a bit more energetic than the -11 version, but it certainly doesn't sound squashed and flabbed out and dead and lifeless, like, you know, everyone tells you, oh my God, why do you squash your masters into oblivion by trying to make them loud at -6 or -7 or whatever? The point is, it can be done. And remember, this is a bass, sub-bass heavy track in D. I mean, think about that. This is D. This is the key of D minor. It's really hard. It's kind of hard to do. There's a trick. It's not so hard if you know the trick, but that's kind of impressive, right? And there's not much difference between these two mixes at two very different, drastically different levels of dynamics. Now, I'm not going to talk about these yet. I want to just go back and forth and show you and explain what the difference is between these two versions. I'm going to focus on the verse because this is where you hear the difference. In the louder crescendo section, they're going to sound almost identical if I do some A-B jumping back and forth by clicking the solo button. I want you to listen to this. We're going to start with the crescendo and work backward towards the verse. There's a lot of energy in the crescendo, and it's a lot of mid-range sound. You know, I've got the sweepy, arpy, wide movement, and then I've got that little glitchy kind of pseudo-guitarish wankage going on, right? So there's a lot of mid-range energy, and these two are going to sound very similar. Here we go. Chances are you heard almost no difference between those two. If we go to the more relaxed solo version where there's only one mid-rangey sound, it's a little more wide in the sides, you might start hearing a subtle difference, but still, because there's a lot of mid-range energy, the difference is going to be incredibly slight, even between these two different levels of dynamics. Now, it's when we go to the verse and there's a much wider dynamic range in the verse. In the original song, the verses were hitting about -9. I think -9. Maybe closer to -10. Somewhere in there. So there's a little more of a wider dynamic range in the verse because it's very quiet and gentle, and the only mid-range sound are the vocals. And it's when you have sounds that are lower than the most upfront, loudest sounds, when you have sounds that are quieter in the mix that you want the listener to be able to hear and distinguish. That's where you start really feeling and hearing the difference between a song with a wide dynamic range and a song with a small, cramped dynamic range. So what I want you to listen for is, well, first let me just A-B without saying anything, and then I'll tell you what to listen for. But see what you notice by yourself. I'm going to start with the most dynamic version and bounce up and down to a more dynamic version. And I'm going to focus on I'm going to just repeat the very first verse over and over. Here we go.
I do my best to learn to listen. 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 I do my best to learn to listen.
All right. So what you're hearing, the snare has a little more presence and snap on it. Kick is about the same. And the vocals is where you really hear the difference, because the vocals are the thing that go fairly quiet compared to the kick and the snare and the sub, and then go loud. It's a much more dynamic movement. And in the -11 version, the vocals are smooth and gentle and relaxing. And in the -6 version, the vocals are a little hotter, a little more dense, a little more like, you know, the singer's right up on the mic grill and just really, getting intense. And it's almost as if the reverb is being pulled out a little bit. The singer is being kind of intense right up on the grill. And it's just the vocals are much more upfront and come out at you a little bit hotter and a little bit sharper in a way. Okay, listen for it one more time.
I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen.
Now, it's that hotter, denser sound of all the elements in the mix, especially the quieter ones that veer a little bit into the low end of the mid-range spectrum. That's the characteristic sound of competitively loud genres. And, a song can't have every element at full volume or there's just no contrast, right? So songs have to rely on certain things that are loud, certain things that are quieter, and it's just the nature of a playlist full of songs that were mastered closer to -6, -7 LUFS, competitive loudness war levels, that there's a certain intensity, a certain hotness to things like the vocals or to types of sounds that are typically balanced a little bit lower in the overall mix. And so there's this kind of spectral density that is characteristic of loud music. And it's that spectral density that makes it really tricky for a DJ to, for example, mix into and out of other spectrally dense songs in that same way. If your song doesn't have that certain bright edge to it, it's going to sound thin, dark, and a little weak overall. The energy goes way down. And I mean, in big sound systems, it's really noticeable. And coming out of crappy, even Pioneer mixers that you find in clubs, they're kind of crappy. I mean, they're not meant to be super clean consoles. They're DJ mixers. And they're going through 3 nasty, mid, high, and low pots and noisy channel trims and a noisy output circuit, right? And it's not a very clean signal. The club environment isn't a clean environment. Festival, even the outdoor festival environment, there's a lot of competing noise, a lot of horrible reflections inside of clubs, horrible room modes and reflections. There's a lot of things that take away from your ability to hear and distinguish the quieter elements of a mix versus the louder elements in a mix. And so a low dynamic range can be helpful in that context. To let people hear every part of your song that you want them to hear. And that's one of the drivers for DJs. It's not just about, oh my God, I want to make people's ears bleed. There's factors to the acoustics of the environment you're playing in. And there's the fact that since nobody else is mixing at a low dynamic range like 11 LUFS, if your song has this more relaxed feel to it, it's just not going to sound like it belongs in the same set. So just hold that thought. I'll circle back to that later when I talk about the other real compelling reason for tracks with a low amount of dynamics, a low dynamic range. What I want to do now, though, is focus on clip to zero versus doing it the traditional way, where you just let everything sum up. You work at a really low volume, like -18 RMS, -12 RMS, and you run everything into a mastering limiter at the end. Let's first look at the 11 LUFS version, which this one's done in the clip to zero way with a clipping cascade all the way through the mix. All the loudness is being done in the mix. There's no limiter on this at the end, no mastering limiter. And then this one here, the green one, is being done without any clipping cascade in the mix. Instead, all the loudness is being done, or any final peak control is being done on the master track. There's very little peak control actually happening. It's about 1 decibel of gain reduction here and there. But listen to the difference a clipper cascade makes versus a not clipper cascade. This is the clean CTZ version, and I'll focus on just the vocals for this part, I think.
I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen.
Not too much difference there, right? Now let's go to something that starts getting a little more energetic, like the solo section. Clean, dirty. Still not super apparent there, unless you're listening close, but I'm hearing the snare start to get a little squashed sounding. Let's go to the crescendo version. Hear how in the conventional way, the kick and the snare are starting to sound just a little bit lifeless compared to using the clipper cascade. And also the, all those mid-range sounds are starting to sound a little harsher and a little harsher overall. All right, I'm not going to harp on this one too much because the difference is subtle, because there's very little actual clipping that needs to be done. The two signals are essentially the same. The clipping's being done in a different way, but the differences are subtle. But where you're going to start hearing a big difference is the conventional way that people try to get loud now, which is no clipper cascade, work at a low volume level, let all your peaks sum up massively on top of each other, and then run it all through a mastering limiter at the end of the track. So I'm going to play the 6 LUFS version using a clipper cascade, using the clip to zero method, versus the -6 version that's just done the conventional way, where everything's clipped at one point at the very end and a big crunch on the mastering limiter. Check out the difference. And let's start with the verse.
I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen.
Can you hear it? Can you hear how much better, cleaner this sounds? It'll get more noticeable as we get into more intense sections. yeah, the drums maintain their punchiness, the kick maintains its roundness, the snare doesn't start sounding stressed. Now it'll become even more apparent when there's a lot of things struggling for your attention in the crescendo section. Not only are the kick and snare starting to sound thinned out, listen to the sub bass. Hopefully you're on a system where you can hear the sub bass, because here the sub bass is still fully present. Here man, it's like audibly dropping by like at least 3 or 4 decibels in apparent volume. It's just the sub bass is so much gone in this version. And then, of course, everything sounds a little harsher and thinner in this version compared to this version. All right, so hopefully, I've demonstrated 2 things with this comparison so far, and then I'm going to go into the last thing. First of all, are you surprised that there's almost no real difference overall, big picture-wise, to the average listener between a dynamic version at 11 LUFS versus a very non-dynamic version at 6 LUFS? When I use the CTZ method, these sounded really similar to each other all the way through. This does not sound horribly squashed, right? And then hopefully I'm also showing you, especially with the comparison between trying to hit -6 LUFS the conventional way versus using a clipper cascade and the clip to 0 type of gain staging approach. Hopefully you can hear that there's a huge difference. And so clearly, clip to 0 gets you much better results regardless of the dynamic range you're ultimately shooting for, right? If you believe dynamics are better, more dynamics are better, and you don't feel a compelling need to compete at the same loudness levels as other people in your genre, that's cool. You're still going to get way better results if you use clip to 0 method. And I'm going to show you how, if your goal is to shoot for 11 LUFS, I'll show you exactly how to set your starting anchor sound so you'll get right close to that ballpark right off the bat, right? Whereas if you do it the conventional way, where you don't think about your gain staging and you just clip everything at the last minute through a single limiter, it sounds noticeably worse, like way worse. You lose all sorts of stuff. You lose your dynamics. Everything gets thinner and harsher and more aggressive, and you lose a lot of sub-bass energy in your bass-heavy genres. And this is one of the reasons people say you can't do songs in D or C, but you can using an approach where you get your loudness in the mix through a clipper cascade, and also if you use another trick I'll talk about in a bit. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is why. I mean, objectively, this sounds great. It's nice and relaxed. If I made an album full of songs like this, I would probably choose to do that album at -11 LUFS or thereabouts. But I'm not doing an album full of mellow, down-tempo, chill songs like this. I'm a producer DJ trying to do a chill-out song in the context of a loud, aggressive set of loud, aggressive music. For that reason, I picked this one, again, because of the extra heat and density and energy and clarity in a loud, crappy listening environment. of those vocals. I want them to hear the singer. And this one just overall, that intensity and energy jibes a lot better with, I'm going to go back to the main project now. And I'm going to play this mix out one more time into the Kotek and teleportal version. And I really don't want to solo it because I'm really trying to keep YouTube from yoinking me. Let's just start from the mix out. And I just want you to pay attention, not so much to my sound on the mix out, but to the intensity, the density, the mid-range presence of this first really loud rise to show you where the song's gonna go, followed by the first pluck or two of her intro melody. Okay, check this out. You hear that, right? That crescendo right at the beginning of the song into like, I'm about to hit you in the face. I'm showing you, I'm giving you a foreshadowing of where this song is going. And it's really dense. And there's just going from your song into that song. Wow, that can be intimidating. Or coming out of the song ends in a similar way. And even the pluck is pretty dense and intense and hot sounding. That's a hot pluck. And so, you need to have something that has had that feel for the last 2 minutes or so as you mix out into the next song, especially if your cut's even harder. I mean, in EDM sets, we do really fast transitions or even super hard cuts, right from one drop into a breakdown of the next, a buildup of the next song, and then right from that drop into the buildup of the next song. And there's always this intensity that you're trying to juggle and balance and keep at a consistent level. And so for that reason, I think the thing I want to point out is, although you could say the vocals seem subjectively a little hotter than they need to be, or a little hotter than is pleasurable, if you were listening to a chill album in your room, right? It's a better match in terms of dense spectral feel. It's a better match for a playlist, either at a live venue in a DJ context like this, or in a Spotify playlist, because nobody listens to albums anymore. People listen to playlists, and your song is always sandwiched between two other songs by two completely different artists. And if your song feels in any way darker and thinner, as opposed to brighter and hotter, your song's going to be judged as kind of meh. That's just how it works. So there's this driver from the consumer side, from the competitive side. And this plays over into how DJs select their tracks, right? DJs will go to a service like Beatport, or there's other services that are even better than Beatport, expensive subscription services. But all of these services, they don't normalize the songs. Your song is being compared against other songs by other DJs that are potentially louder and hotter than yours. And, when a DJ's going there with their budget for the week to buy, 10 or 20 more songs to add to their crates, and they're popping through they basically go straight to the part of the waveform where the buildup starts, right? They feel the buildup into the drop, build up into the drop, build up into the drop. So your song comes along while they're auditioning all these potential things they're going to buy. And they hit your buildup, and it's dynamic and clear and open and a little thin and a little dark. And then, you hit your drop, and it's dynamic. Sure, yeah, the drum and snare may hit hard, but it's a little thin. It's a little dark. It just doesn't sound the same. It doesn't fit in the same ballpark. And so the DJs are going to go, nah, that's going to be way too hard to mix. I'm going to run into the classic problem of, no, you can't just turn up the trim, Dan. You can't just turn up the treble fade, a treble pot or the mid pot, because any of those actions starts oversaturating the crappy DJ mixer itself on the way out to the front of house system. And then if the front of house guy who's, trying to deafen the patrons, unfortunately, right? If they've got everything already up kind of to the threshold of what the limiter on the system can handle, you're suddenly trying to crank another, 3 or 4 dB of gain and cranking the trim pots, I'm sorry, the mid pot and maybe even the high pot to just get that same density out of your song suddenly. And now you're blowing over the limiter. And now you're squashing it into the front of house limiter. It just doesn't work. I know you've made the argument that limiters are more forgiving than you think, but no, not in the real world. Not when the DJ before you was playing ridiculously loud songs and not paying good attention to their, trim pots anyway and the output volume on the mixer. And then you're trying to mix in after them and not sound like a huge letdown to the crowd. No, it doesn't work that way. Maybe if you're a big name artist headlining the stage at EDC or Tomorrowland or whatever, maybe in that situation you can work with the front of house person and sound check your set and get everything leveled in gain stage so you have a little wiggle room on your outputs trim and your EQ knobs. Yeah, but not for 98% of us who don't get to play like that as a headliner at a major festival with a really good sound engineer working a really good, front of house system. Doesn't work like that. You're working with, crappy live reinforcement engineers in crappy environments on relatively crappy systems, and you're coming in after a DJ who was crappy, right? And cranking really loud stuff. So you just have to be in the same ballpark as them or everything falls apart and you sound like a dud, okay? So there's reasons I think in this context, and in the DJ context especially, this is the superior mix. Even though subjectively you might argue that the more dynamic version is a little more pleasing to our ears. But there's not that much difference. Let me do this again. Listen to this verse. This one that's fully dynamic. Oops, I have to start the audio engine again. Sorry. One more time.
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you have so much to say, if I connect with your position, I will learn so much that way.
There's not that much difference. Can you hear it? They're effectively the same. This is just a little hotter, a little denser, right? There's nothing wrong with this mix. This is not the horrible thing everyone says happens when, oh my God, these terrible producers and DJs doing these loudness war mixes. No, you can make a loudness war mix that kicks ass and is really dynamic, both on the micro level and the macro level. It's about how you arrange and about how you mix, period. Seriously, go listen to Teleportal if you want a really good example of that. Rezz in general is an amazing, whoever her team is, I don't know if she does her own mixing and mastering. I don't know if she just has a certain mixing and mastering engineer she works with all the time, but her stuff is good. She's got really challenging song arrangements to mix and master, and they're brilliant. And they're full of dynamics, full of them. Okay, so no, I don't care if the waveform looks like this. It can be a very dynamic song. That waveform looks intimidating, but this song is punchy as hell. It's dynamic as hell. It's going to take you on a trip. Plenty of macro dynamics and micro dynamics. So go check that out if you don't believe me. It can be done. And it can be done really well if you use a clipper cascade, a clip to zero. So that's going to lead me into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is there's one other very legitimate argument for less dynamics. It's not just about what DJs want, and it's not just a matter of taste that, oh, some genres sound better if they're really squashed, right? No, it's not like that. Those do factor in, I suppose, to some extent, but the real reason, I think, we've got a loudness war still, even now with the normalized Spotify level of platform. The real reason is because people don't listen to music the same way they did for those of us who grew up in the 70s, okay? There was a time when the only place you could listen to music, really listen to it, really appreciate it, was in your living room on a good turntable going into a good, 200 watt, 300 watt component hi-fi system, running into speakers that were typically 3-element speakers with a big 12-inch woofer or 15-inch woofer, 4-inch, 3 or 4-inch mid-range, and like a 3-inch tweeter or tweeter horn, right? 3-component speakers, big monsters that look like the stuff you see in studios, soffit mounted into the walls. This was in people's living rooms. This is how I listen to music, right? And you're in a quiet living room listening to one album at a time. Okay, so yeah, you would turn up the volume knob and maybe even play with your little 5-band EQ, parametric EQ sliders on your console or whatever. And you would set each album to sound good to you at the loudness you wanted. Yeah, that's how it worked. But nobody does that anymore. Nobody has systems like that anymore. Hell, most of us producers don't even have speakers that size and amplifiers that big. We've got, at best, 8-inch near-field monitors, most of us, right? And most consumers are listening on their iPod earbuds or their Bose QC35 Quiet Comfort headphones, or maybe a slightly better pair of wired headphones, or probably their crappy MacBook speakers, maybe even straight out of their phone, literally straight out of their phone, the crappy transducers in a phone, or maybe at best some kind of Bluetooth brick that's about 4 inches big, or maybe some desktop speakers that have a tiny little 1-inch or 2-inch woofer, right? And maybe one other driver that's doing the mid and high range. And you're not listening in a quiet house most of the time. You're listening in the gym. You're listening in your car. You're listening in a noisy restaurant on crappy speakers that aren't turned up loud enough anyway, right? You're listening on the train. You're listening as you're walking down the street from the train to your office or from your car to the office, right? You're listening in a noisy office environment where your coworkers are talking loudly, people in the meeting room are laughing loudly nearby, the AC vents are humming and making all sorts of like high frequency and low frequency noise interruptions. There's just like so much noise in our listening environment now, and you're not listening to just one album at a time. You're listening to playlists, your Spotify playlist of the day or the moment, right? And so because of all this competing noise in the environment around you, coupled with your crappy sound systems you're listening on, like especially in cars, right? You've got road noise from the tires, you got wind noise from the speed, you've got engine noise, okay? You've got all this noise competing with what you're trying to listen to. And so if there's too much dynamic range, nobody can hear the quieter parts of the song. They just can't hear it. They can't distinguish it. They don't feel the nuance of the vocalist because half the nuance is being masked by all the background environmental noise. So even on a song per song basis, consumers themselves are tending to prefer small dynamic range because it lets them hear all the song elements better. It lets them hear the entire mix more closely to what the original producer and mixing engineer intended. Okay, so that's another really important driver for all this that I don't hear people talking about much. It's just until our listening environments and our gear drastically changes, loudness war is always going to be here for pop music, for rock music, for whatever. Okay, so let's go on to why the CTZ strategy works. Why a clipper cascade actually works. And I think what I want to start with there is the matter of endorsements, right? I don't want you to just take my word for it. I'm a relative nobody. I mean, some of you know me, some of you know the people I've run around with and learned from. Some of you understand that my videos stand on their own merits without me needing to have bona fides or whatever. But don't take my word for it. In my Clip to Zero handbook, there's a section called Is Clip to Zero a Common Practice? And I try to make the point that a lot of producers and engineers who work especially in loud genres have stumbled upon this same approach, even though they don't necessarily call it by that name or conceptualize it or explain it this way. But I point out a place where I found Luca Pretalesi, Grammy-winning mastering, mixing engineer, does lots of loud electronic music and loud pop music. And I've got a link here that'll take you to a video where he says you should do lots of little clips all over the project in the mix. Don't do it all at the limiter, right? So here's another mastering engineer, lots of bona fides saying the same basic thing, okay? And then recently I found out from my friend and mentor, Il Gates, that Edit from the Glitch Mob has been watching my videos and has actually had quite some aha moments about my approach to gain staging, this clip to zero method, and my explanations about clipping versus other things, right? So I got a link here where Il Gates is kind of relating a conversation he had with Edit about my stuff and how Edit found that useful. So, I mean, it's not just me. Edit's done, come on, it's the Glitch Mob. So much time, so much history, so much experience, so much obvious mastery of the art. And yet they're finding this stuff like, oh, yeah, this does make things easier, especially for a kind of, a new kind of live performance thing he's doing that's pretty difficult, where he's basically live mixing a lot of stems in real time. And so if those stems don't have the right spectral balance with each other, it sounds funky, right? So anyway, you can go look at those if you want. Coming back to the project, I think the main thing I want to talk about now is this notion of a clipper cascade. Let's blow all these tracks out so you can see it again. The basic idea behind Clip to Zero, one of the basic ideas, is the notion of a clipper cascade. So every source track at some point runs into a clipper real early to help reduce the dynamic range of that sound and help you find the loudest possible, help you get that sound as loud as it could be. And there's two ways to make a sound louder. You have to squish its dynamic range to make it louder, because you have to bring the RMS up higher, which means your peaks are going to start approaching zero or even going past zero. So somehow you have to squeeze the dynamic range of any given sound by saturating from the bottom and clipping from the top so that it's a smaller distance from RMS to peak. And that way you can fit it up closer to zero and not go over zero, right? And then it gets compounded when you take three sounds that are getting summed together somewhere with other sounds, right? Like my melodic sounds, I have three sounds happening at one point in the song. And they all add up on top of each other. Where their transients line up with each other, the peak gets higher. The distance between the peak and the RMS gets higher. So even if I've clipped any one of these sounds individually to make it loud enough to sit where it needs to balance-wise in the mix, then they're all going to get summed somewhere at some point up the chain of your busing, and they're going to go above 0 again. And so you want to clip them down again with another clipper. And then that bus is going to feed into another bus where you've done the same thing. And so, just in my midline section, my mid-range sounds, I've got 2 different general buses that are summing together yet again. So here on my midline bus, I have another clipping event happening right here to keep all this stuff from going over 0 as it goes up the chain. And then as we keep going up the chain, I have my vocals and my mid-range sounds and my sub sounds all summing together into a bus I call tonal. And again, they're adding up with each other, possibly going above 0 again because of the way they sum. So I've got another clipper right here, okay? And same with my drums. Individual drum sounds like the kick and snare, even the tops might need to be limited, and then they're all getting summed together into a drum bus, and they're going to need to get clipped again here. And then finally, this is the way I do things, I'll talk about this a little bit later, I keep my drums and all my tonal stuff separate until the very last minute. This is one of the things you have to do in loud music. And so by keeping them separate until the last minute, they finally do have to sum together, and they sum together on my pre-master bus. And so once again, I've got a clipper happening right here. Okay, so the point is, clipping cascades yield a better sound. Don't believe me? Listen to Luca Predalesi. Okay, he'll agree. He'll endorse that thought. It's better than just letting all that stuff sum up into these huge caterpillar-looking waveforms that you run into a single mastering limiter at the end and do a huge crush on. It's just going to destroy your mix. Do it in the mix. Get your loudness in the mix. Control your dynamics in the mix. Now, what's novel about my clip to 0 approach is like you could set that clipping cascade at any gain staging level throughout your project, right? I don't know how Luca works that way. I haven't looked super close. But I have found over time, you get a lot of benefits if you set all those clipping thresholds on every track and bus throughout your project. If you set it at 0 dBFS, period. The reason for that is many. And this is the biggest thing about my clip to 0 strategy. Part of it's the clipper cascade, but part of it is it makes it easier to compare your mix with a reference track as you're working, even in the early stages of composing and choosing your sounds and doing sound design, right? I use a tool. My favorite A/B tool is called A/B metric. And, right now, for example, I could just click this button and instantly compare my mix against Teleportal, or against a couple other Rezz tracks, or a Rezz and Deadmau5 track I really like, or some other tracks that I have different flavors and feels, and so sometimes I look at them, or anything else I want to bring in here, right? The point is, this is what's wrong with referencing. If you work at a really quiet dynamic range, if you set your project up so that most of your average RMS is down at -18 and you've got 6 dB of huge headroom above even some of your highest peaks, and I'll run your master, there's still a 6 dB of headroom above the loudest peak on the master, like all the well-intentioned device tells you to do, your mix is going to be super dynamic, and yet you're comparing and contrasting your mix against these squashed masters, against these low dynamic range masters that are hot and dense. And so you try to artificially do all your sound design and your processing of individual sounds to be comparably hot and dense at this wide dynamic range, right? You're not referencing apples to apples. You're referencing apples to oranges. And so you set up your mix so it's like, yeah, it sounds just like my favorite reference track I was trying to emulate the sound of and the spectral balance of. But you've done this in a wide dynamic range down at -12 or -18 RMS. And then you run it all into a mastering limiter and say, now I need to get up to -7 LUFS or -6 LUFS or whatever. And you take those already too hot sounds in your mix and suddenly make them so much hotter because you're clipping the crap out of them. And everything gets squashed to hell and distorted. And you go, why don't I sound like my master? This sounds like crap. Why don't I sound like the reference track? They're loud and it's really clean sounding and dynamic and punchy, but mine sounds like hammered crap. Because you referenced it totally the wrong way at totally the wrong gain staging, okay? So clip to zero avoids all that because right from the beginning, if I decide I'm going to be building a song in a genre that most of the reference tracks are going to be hitting -7 and -6 LUFS, I do my song from the beginning, from the very first sound, so that as I'm building up the entire mix, it's going to be hitting -7 LUFS on the loudest sections as I go. And so every step of the way, when I sound design any specific sound to have the same density and brightness and sharpness as what's in my reference track, I'm comparing apples to apples because I'm already working at the same loudness. Again, just to show you, here's the solo crescendo section. I'm going to play this with just a quick measurement of the loudness in this section. Let's get this back up. All right, so this is my solo crescendo, the loudest portion of the track. That's going to be in the blue side. Over here is teleportal, and it's a drop. Specifically, it's a drop section in teleportal, the loudest part of teleportal, or one of the loudest parts, right? So check out the loudness measurement. There, I dared YouTube again to flag me for copyright. Look, I'm working at the same density and intensity. I'm working in the same dynamic range. The entire time I built this song, it was built in a way that I'm always comparing my spectral balance against Rezz's spectral balance, my favorite reference track. Apples to apples. And this is the key thing about clip to zero. If I have a sound that can't be made loud enough to fit into the framework that I'm going to talk about a little later, you'll tell really quickly you can't make that sound loud enough without destroying it. Some sounds can't be made loud enough for really loud, dense, low dynamic mixes. Some sounds are just, they're too fragile. You have to do some pretty heavy hammering on a sound to make it sit at a super high RMS and still sound good. So anyway, that's one reason for clip to zero is you're always working at the same gain staging as the masters you're referencing against. Now, another reason for clip to zero is, again, it lets you fail fast when you're choosing candidate sounds. Like, okay, I want a synth part, I want it to have this kind of feel. Okay, I found something that sounds good, or I built something that sounds good. Now let me bring it into the mix. Oh, wait a minute. Wow, it's too quiet. Even when I put the fader at unity, wow, it's just too quiet. It doesn't sit in the mix at the right spot, or it's too dull. It's too dark. How do I get it hotter to sit where it needs to sit in the mix, right? And so you start doing some quick and dirty sound design to it, which is usually saturate from the bottom, clip from the top, see if you can make it louder successfully. And if the sound starts falling apart when you do that, you throw it away and you look for something different that can survive that treatment to fit into the gain staging of your mix that matches your master, your reference tracks, right? Using clip to zero lets you fail fast which is a good thing. Oh, that sound's just not going to work. I can't get that snare quite right. I can't get that kick loud enough and still keep the roundness on the bottom. I can't get that synth sound. Oh my God, these vocals, I'm doing something massively wrong with these vocals because I can't get the vocals hot enough to sit out in front and on top of the mix because I'm already working at the target loudness, the target dynamic range. Okay, another reason for clip to zero, the final thing is that when you use this technique, it's super easy to drop the dynamics at any point, to pull things out of the clippers and give it more dynamics, and it will still sound just as good, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you make a mix that sounds great at low dynamics, and then you pull it down out of the clippers to relax the dynamics and give it a little more dynamic room for the sounds that were going above zero and getting clipped off, if you pull the whole mix down, your balance will still sound perfect. But it's not true if you go in the other direction. If you work at a really low RMS level with lots of headroom above the peaks, and you set up the balance to sound right that way, and then you push it up into clippers somehow, whether it's a clipping cascade or whether it's a final limiter at the end, your balance will change. Sounds that sounded great before will suddenly sound out of whack with each other somehow. It's going to be way too hard to demo that to you, so I can't, but what I did demo to you was I made this song in the range of -6 LUFS right from the beginning. And then I just pulled the signal down out of the clipping cascade and it still sounded great. And I did not change a single fader in the entire project. I did not have to change the relative balance of any sound in the project. And it still sounded great. I guarantee you if I had built this song at -11 LUFS and gone in the other direction, that would not be true. So that's the other reason for clip to zero. If you can make it sound good in a tight dynamic range, then it'll sound fine in a wider dynamic range, and you really aren't going to have to tweak anything at the end. You just pull the whole signal down out of the clippers a little bit until you're happy, right? And feel like you're getting what you're looking for. So those are the reasons I recommend the clip to zero strategy. And if you want more details about that, you can go look that up in a couple places. So in my list of producer tutorials, I first introduced the clip to zero strategy in these two videos after I'd been talking about clippers and isolation for a while. And then I said, here's a strategy for gain staging with clippers in a way that has all these benefits. And then more recently, I kind of went over it again in my two very recent Loudness is in the Mix, not the master videos. So just go back, spend a little time with those. And also, all of those videos point to this book, and you can read this, however many page book, where I try to describe it in written form, because some people like that better. Okay, so that's pretty much all I want to say about why CTZ is better. I mean, you certainly heard the demo of why either one of these clip to zero approaches sounded better than trying to do it the conventional way. Okay, now let's flip over to how this song works in the key of D. Going below F is hard because there's roll-off on the subs. Even if they're rated down to 30 hertz or 25 hertz or whatever, they don't really have full equal power when you get close to that end of the spectrum. Everything starts rolling off after, depending on the speaker, like my HS8s, they start rolling off after something like 50 hertz. So even low F is already requiring more energy to push than, say, something that sits around 50 hertz or higher. So trying to do a song in C or D is difficult, but there's reasons you want to do it, and there's a trick for doing it that makes it actually pretty easy. So I'm going to talk about that and show you the trick. First thing I want to show you is why. Why do you want to make some songs in the key of D and C? For this, you have to think like a DJ, and you have to understand that DJs like to mix harmonically. You've got all these songs in your crates, and you're trying to seamlessly mix from one to the other, and the notion there is harmonic mixing. So for example, if I have a song that I'm playing currently that's in F minor, I can pick a song that's in C minor or B flat minor or A flat minor. It works like the 2 next to it on the inner ring or the 1 in front of it on the outer ring. Any one of these 3 other candidate keys will sound nice if you mix from F minor into a song in one of these other keys, right? That's the idea behind harmonic mixing. Now, the problem is, in bass-heavy genres, especially festival-oriented bass music, heavy bass music, F minor is a very popular key because it has a lot of power in the subs. G is also pretty popular because it's not that much higher than F. It doesn't have quite as much weight as F, but it's a popular key. And most bass music's written in a minor key, right? So that's why I'm focusing on the inner ring. So G works okay, but you're losing a little bit of that heavy power feeling. Some producers like to go F to E is only a half step. It's 1 semitone. So, you know, some producers will flirt with songs in E. But I want you to notice that G and E aren't next to F. And then there's another kind of genre, the more techno-oriented genres and tech house genres. They like to use A because there's this certain resonant, pumping, hot energy in the sub-range you can get in the key of A. And a lot of these steady beat pounding songs at faster RPMs, like 128, right? They like to use A because it's still in the sub-range, but now your focus is on energy and brightness, even in the subs. So A is a really popular key for certain genres. And the problem is, if you try to go from a song in F to A, well, that's not harmonically related, or from F to E, or from F to G, right? These are the popular ones, E, A, G, and F. And how do you get between them? How do you transition across sets? And I want to go from a song in F minor eventually to a song that's over in E minor. Well, you got to move through the wheel. And look what's in the middle, C and D. If you don't have enough songs in your crates that are in the key of C and D, you're going to be a little more limited in how much harmonic freedom you have mixing around different songs in your crates and playlists. And so a lot of producers have learned tricks to mix without trying to do it harmonically, right? We'll use hard transitions and hard cuts. We'll talk to the audience for a second. We'll do something to reset their ears so that the sudden change from one key to a very unrelated key doesn't sound bad, right? But especially if you do slower, trancier music, it's really nice to have songs in C and D so that you can do harmonic mixing and get from one side of your playlist to the other without any issue, because you have plenty of choices here and here to help you move from, for example, F to G, or from G over to F, or from G to A, or from E to A to G, or from F to, get to G and then move over to A eventually, right? I mean, you need these songs in the middle. So that's why you need to figure out how to make your songs in C and D, even if you do sub-heavy music, okay? So the trick to doing sub-heavy music is pretty simple, and it involves understanding how sub-bass works with room modes, okay? In a club with 4 walls, it's less of a problem outdoors at festivals, but in a club with 4 walls, certainly in your room where you produce music, if you're using speakers instead of headphones, the sub-bass frequencies are so long, they bounce off the walls and they create standing waves in your room. And so for any given sub-frequency, there's going to be higher pressure nodes at certain physical geometries of your room and lower pressure nodes in other places in your room because of these standing waves where the wave reflects back on itself in phases. And so you have this notion of room modes, high pressure regions, low pressure regions. And when you put your head in a high pressure region, the sub bass sounds louder. If you put your head in a low pressure region, the sub bass suddenly sounds way quieter, right? Like can almost disappear sometimes, depending on how bad it is. And this is true in big clubs. It's true in medium-sized club rooms and small little, second DJ off in the back room type rooms. You have these modes, and depending on where listeners are standing, they're going to hear your sub bass or not. If you have a song that just hammers along an F, right? You'll stand in one spot and you can hear that F and it's totally vibrating your body. You move a foot or two to the right and suddenly you're in a low pressure node and you're not hearing that sub bass nearly as strongly as other things in the mix, right? So a trick producers who understand this employ is they move the notes around a lot. They glide throughout the spectrum. They glide throughout pitches in the sub range. So that's why you'll hear a lot of loopy, swoopy songs where the sub bass is just constantly moving all over the place and it's doing these slow trap-like glides, right? Even in other genres of music. So we can, and what that does is it keeps moving the room nodes around. It pushes the nodes around because at every pitch, at every frequency, the position of those physical high and low pressure nodes inside the room, they move, they shift, they change. So if you move the frequency around, you're giving everyone a little bit of equal access to the high pressure areas, right? And so over time, on average, it sounds like a more balanced kind of sub energy, even at different pitches, if your sub is following some melodic riff, okay? So that's what's happening in this song. Again, check this out.
I do my best to learn to listen.
Let me collapse my drums up for a minute and just show you that sub line real quick. Here's the actual sub line I'm using. It's in the root of D, but I'm bouncing above D and below D, and sometimes way above D, and even up to a high D at the end for this riff. So let's just solo this out and listen to it for a sec. Actually, let me solo it with the sub top so you can hear it clearly. Unless you've got headphones on, let's get this one in there too. All right, that's the whole sub riff. I don't really vary that for this song. Now I want to show it to you with the spectrum analyzer so you can see what's happening here, because this is the trick. Watch carefully here. The high A note, which is right at the very tip top of the sub range, even depending on where crossovers are set, you could argue that that high A is out of the sub range at 77 hertz. But I'm bouncing a lot through this whole range here, just with the sub. And because the sub moves pretty frequently because there's a riff to it, you're getting some of that sub bass movement already, pushing the room modes around. And so that's why I don't linger on the root of the song too much. I'm doing other notes above and below the root to keep moving the energy into the root. Okay, move those notes around, land them on the root on the downbeats and backbeats of the song, and then get back out again. Okay, so that's one trick, but then I'm doing the other trick, which is to factor your kick into the equation. So let's bring the kick in now. I'll just solo the kick and add it in. All right. Now watch this same region again right here. I want you to notice what's happening right here. The kick is tuned 1/4 above the root of the song. The song is in D minor, and the kick is in G. Okay. Now, because the kick is up quite a bit in the spectrum, and because the kick hits at the same time, okay, you'll notice that in, let's do it this way. You'll notice that the D always happens on the downbeat of the kick. 1, 3, right? Well, kick and snare, actually. Kick, snare, kick, snare. Actually, I'm wrong about that. These are the bars. So kick, snare, kick, snare, kick, snare. And there's kicks happening by themselves in the middle here. Right? Every time this D hits, I'm using a trick with the kick to help move the room nodes really specifically and rapidly from a higher pitch, a 4th up. It could be a 5th, it could be a 6th up. You could tune your kick to any one of those, harmonically related intervals. But the kick hits, the sub is hitting right on the downbeat, and it's being sidechained for just 50 milliseconds or so for the transient of the kick. And then the sub crossfades into the tail of the kick. And so the boom of the kick, which is hitting in G, is quickly crossfading and smoothly crossfading into the full power of the D note. And so what it looks like in the spectrum is you'll see the kick bump here and then a smooth roll from the kick to where the sub hits. Watch again. See that? Kick hits about here at G. Like I'm going to put this here and hold it at G. So right where that little thin crosshair is where the first part of the sub wave is going to hit. And did you see how fast it rolled all the way down to D? See that roll? So that little movement from the kick itself into the D is making the sub energy push through the room and move those room modes around. And that's what helps you if you glide down from a higher pitch into the root at D or into the root at C, if you're doing the song in C. That's the whole trick. You need to make that sub region glide and move. And you can do it either with fast glides, like from the boom of the kick to the sub. There's actually 2 ways to do a kick, right? There's the dead mouse way, which, dead mouse will say, just make your kick a transient, like literally no body boom on it. And instead just glue it with your sub and a super short sub pulse that is the tone of, your bass line, the root of your bass line. In fact, it lets you have very busy bass lines, very fast, punchy bass lines by making the kick just a transient, kind of like in trap. In 808s, the kick is really just a little transient. And most of the quote-unquote 808 kick is just a big sine wave, right? It's a similar concept. If you just make your kick this really thin transient and nothing else, you can have any kind of sub line or bass line with a lot of sub energy in it bouncing around all around that kick, and it'll sound great, right? But this is a lazy song where the kick has to hold the bottom end too, because there's a lot of space between the slow subline. So in my case, and in many songs, the kick itself needs to hold weight in the subregion. It needs to have a boom in the subregion. And so then you have to just really carefully crossfade from the kick to the sub, and I'll talk about that later. But you can also use that to do this gliding trick, whether you're doing it with basses alone. You just need to make sure the bass, the sub bass, does that pitch drop into the root at D or C, right? Or like I'm doing in this song, I make sure the kick itself, the boom portion of the kick, is tuned up like a good 4th or 5th above the root of D. And then I quickly use side chaining and the crossfade of the side chain to bounce, to glide from the kick into the D, to emphasize. I'm going to land on D for a second, but I pushed you through a whole bunch of other notes that my speakers can push more successfully. And I'm moving the room modes around in your listening environment so you just hear it better, right? And that's how you get power out of a song that's in the key of D or C. Another trick you'll hear producers do is they'll just put a lot of big, long, slow bass drop glides in, like boo, boo. They'll throw all these like really super long sub-drop movements at various points of the song. Again, just to give you that sense, everyone in the room, an equal sense of that power, because at some point those high pressure nodes are going to move through each person because the fundamental pitch of the sub is rolling through that whole region, okay? And pushing those physical room modes around of high pressure and low pressure. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about songs in C or D, because the Swan demonstrated that. Okay, now, here's the fun part. This is a question I get a lot, so I just want to address it for once and for all here. I do explain in this clip to zero strategy how to set your initial gain staging. All right. If I know that I want to do a song at 7 LUFS on my loudest section, I know exactly where to set a fundamental anchor sound. If I want to do a song in 10 LUFS, I want something more relaxed, or 11 LUFS, I know exactly where to gain stage one key important sound, okay? So I call this, and this mixing approach is not unique to me. I've had plenty of mentors, Il Gates, Seth Drake, other people have explained this concept of mixing to a framework, okay? There are 3 fundamentally important sounds that are the heart of every kind of electronic dance music: the kick, the snare, and the sub. If those 3 sounds are in balance with each other and they're set at the right gain staging level, you can take every other sound in the mix and just push them up gently into that framework until they sound right against that framework. And what you do is you almost never touch any of those framework sounds once you've set them. It's a framework. It's like the framework of a house. Build it, and now put up the walls. Put the roof on it, right? But the framework stays put, okay? Now, the most important sound in that framework is the kick. The kick is the anchor for the entire framework. Over time, as your mix builds up and you get more dense and need to make sure certain important things stand out where they need to stand out, your kick will never move. It is the anchor. Your sub, you might push your sub a little louder or a little lower. You'll test your sub at slightly different relationships to that kick, but you're going to leave your kick where it is. And it's the same with the snare. As your mix builds up and gets a lot more mid-energy and gets a little more dense and more crowded, you may find your snare needs to push through a little harder, not just in volume or balance, but also perhaps in brightness and sharpness, okay? Or you might find your snare is way too damn loud and bright, and you need to pull it down. And so over time, as your mix builds up, you might be fine-tuning your sub and snare a little bit, right? But your kick never moves. Your kick is the anchor. So the trick is in step 5 of this guide. I say, here's how to estimate how to get to your ideal loudness when you work in this gain staging way. It's very predictable every single time when you set your clippers at 0 and you work in this way. The whole trick, and I say right here, the kick is the most important and difficult sound, right? And the basic idea of, if your framework sounds are a kick and a snare, and together they're roughly hitting at -10 max momentary, then you're going to easily be able to get to -8 or -7 or -6 integrated LUFS across your loudest drop or chorus, okay? That's the key. Wherever you set the max momentary value of your kick, a good mix will end up being roughly 3 decibels louder give or take a little bit. In the loudest section of your song, measured as an integrated measurement, an average over that loudest section. So that's the magic number. It's like, how loud do you want your loudest section to be? Take 3 away from that and set that as the max momentary value on your kick. Okay, so let me show you how that works. And this is exactly how I did this. If I look at my kick alone, right, it's a nice round kick. Let's go to the listen bus. Let's just pull up this simple meter. I like this meter because it doesn't cover up too much screen space. You can measure things in RMS mode, all these nice RMS values, including crest factor, or you can measure LUFS values. So what we're looking at is the momentary max. That's what we want to do. And when I first brought the kick in, I did a little bit of changing to it. So in this particular case, it's going to sit a tiny bit quieter than -10. But when I first brought it in, and before I did some final shaping on it, it was hitting exactly -10 when I started this project. Let's see what it hits now. Right? You only need one kick to get this measurement because it's a momentary. It's the peak. It's like the peak value of the momentary loudness. -10.6. And the only reason it's here at -10.6, if I go back to the kick track and I go to quantum, because I was transient shaping this to keep the kick a little round. I'm doing some specific things to the transient portion and pulling it back a little bit to emphasize the sustain and to sharpen up the transient portion and take a couple resonances out of it that I wanted, and even sharpen it up a little bit with a kind of bus style compressor. Actually, that's not even hitting now at the level I have that at one point. But this is definitely enhancing, rather dropping the low end a little bit. And no, it's enhancing the low end a little bit. And then a little bit of EQ shaping here to pull out the boxiness and de-emphasize some of the higher end transients, because this is by default is a pretty sharp sounding kick with a sharp transient on it. So I often throw up something like this and just play with the transient balance and some processing on the transient. This is a great plugin. So if I were to go back to, I'm really hesitant to take this off. It should be okay. I might have made a fine adjustment, but at this point, I'll just let it go. Here's where I usually start the kick. Yeah, okay. And that's a little louder than -10. I actually started out with it somewhere like this. Right? I had a slightly less transient to start with, and I had it sitting at -10 when I started the project. But then as I went on and adjusted things a wee bit, I mellowed out the kick. Oops. Are you not going to load up? There we go. And so now, see, I did do some finer adjustment on it. I know the EQ looked different. So let's just undo a few times. I don't know if I can undo this, God damn it. I knew I should have saved that. Either way, what did it end up looking like? I think I scooped this out a bit and probably tightened it up about there. I feel like this was less too. That's about right. Okay, so see, I'm in the ballpark of -10. So the point is, I set my kick at -10. And then from that framework, from that anchor rather, then I bring in my snare. and I found a snare sound I liked. And I adjusted a little bit over the course of things to make it a little softer or a little sharper as was dictated by the mix. But the point is, right at the beginning, both of them are hitting. I shouldn't have closed that meter. Let's open it up again. Each of them are hitting, roughly -10 max momentary. Right? Let's go look at the snare itself. It's probably a little quieter than -10 now. Come on. Yeah, it's just a little quieter, but it's pretty much the same as the kick. Remember, the kick was hitting at -10.6. So usually you want to just start with the kick and the snare at roughly the same max momentary value, because they're going to have relatively the same LUFS or RMS or perceived loudness, right? Get them balanced together to start with. And then I might adjust the snare quieter or louder depending on the needs of the mix as the mix goes along. But now once you have your kick and your snare in place, then you bring in your subs. Make any kind of sub line early. Pick that tone and sound you want for your sub. And at first I like to do just the kick and the snare and the sub by itself without a top layer on that sub. And the way that I think about the subs is partly by ear. Now that's just the sub, no top layer. And depending on what you're listening to this on, you may not even hear that sub. Hopefully you're listening on headphones or a good system that has a subwoofer on it. I will put a top layer on it just to let you hear it better. We'll put the top layer back on. And this time I'm going to look at it with a oscilloscope. So we're going to go back to the listen bus. We're going to grab my favorite oscilloscope. And let's make sure we're looking at the kick, the snare, the sub, and we're looking at the layers. There we go. So this orange thing is the kick. The blue thing is a snare, purple thing is a sub. These white lines represent 0. The outermost line is 0 dB full scale. And then every successive line is 3 dB quieter than that. So this is 0, 3, 6, 12, and then it gets pretty faint as it goes further down, 6, 9, 12, and so on. What's important here is that usually you want to end up with your sub somewhere in the range of 6 dB to 4 dB quieter than your anchor kick. So if my kick is hitting 0, which it is, see how the peaks come right up to the 0 line? My sub wants to be somewhere in this range of 4 to 6. Almost always. Almost without fail in bass heavy music. Another way you can look at it is through a spectrum analyzer. And the easy thing to do is look at a good reference track and see where the sub peaks tend to hit in relation to some reference line in your spectrum analyzer, and then just make your peaks come to roughly the same spot. So watch. See how I'm sitting? I'm sitting about 15.6 dB on this particular spectrum analyzer. Down here, well, it doesn't show the actual number until I go here. 12 dB, right? So this is a super hammer heavy song. So they clearly, for this song, for Teleportal, they push this sub closer to the 4 dB range, right? And that's about as loud as I've ever seen it. So, just a few dB here on something like an oscilloscope can help you get your sub in the right ballpark. And the general rule of thumb I would recommend is start with your sub down around 6 decibels lower than, the highest transient of your kick. which again, if you do clip to 0, makes it easy because you're clipping your kick and snare. They're your two loudest sounds, and you're clipping them right at 0. So it's super easy to just go, I want my sub to be at -6 or -5 or -4. And boom, done. Easy. Don't have to think about it. If you're in a room where you can't hear your sub really well, you can have a pretty high degree of confidence that if your sub is sitting somewhere in this range, you're in the ballpark, okay? Or you can look at it this way and figure it out from just looking at the height in a good spectrum analyzer. Pro tip, I've said it a bazillion times before, but I'll say it again. If you use a spectrum analyzer, make sure it lets you set the tilt of the spectrum analyzer. In this particular one, they call it the weighting. And you always want to roll off of 3 decibels per octave. In this case, they call it roll 3. In other scopes, it'll just be a value like -3, or it might be just 3. What that means is, and you can check it, run pink noise through your spectrum analyzer. And if you run pink noise through and it looks pretty much flat, horizontal, straight across, that's how you want to look at your spectrums. And that will give you an accurate readout of your sub and how high it sits versus all the other sounds in the mix, which in bass heavy music, as you can see, the sub sits higher than every other sound in the mix. And then pretty much everything from about 700K 700 hertz up is pretty much a flat line, right? Now, of course, this is just the drum and kick, so it looks a little awkward, but look at, Rezz's tune here. See how that's pretty much just a flat line? And then you'll have a little bit of a scoop here in the low mids. Is pretty normal, and that's okay, unless there's something really tonal and resonant and melodic happening here, like a vocal or a sharp lead or a full lead or something, then you'll see resonant peaks here. So if I turn on my whole mix again, for example.
I do my best to learn to listen.
So you got vocal resonance here, chord resonant from the electric piano here, that's normal, but mostly this thing looks straight across.
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you
And then the sub bass is quite a bit higher, okay? So there's your tips for setting the sub bass relative to the kick and snare. And then once you get the sub, kick, and snare sounding good together, just leave them. And every other sound, you're going to fader up into that framework. That's your framework. And so that's the key. That's how I mix. You mix by ear. Kick, sub, snare, set them, forget them. Write your song, build everything up, get a rough mix, and then in final mix down, focus on your snare and sub, adjust them so they sit audibly where you want them to in the mix, and the sub's providing the power you want in the mix, right? And then after you've kind of reset the snare and the sub against the kick, then focus on the rest of your sounds and do fine adjustments on their balance to sit where they need to in that framework of kick, snare, and sub, even the vocals, right? Now, in any kind of mix with vocals, the vocals also have to be really present, but there's some other tricks for that I'll talk about in a minute. All right, so you want your song to be 7 LUFS, which is what I recommend. Shoot for 7, even go down as low as 8, and you'll be in the ballpark competitively with every loud banger out there. You don't need to go to 6. This song doesn't need to be at 6. I would pull it back to 7 if I did this. I would use my VCA group to pull those slightly down out of the clippers to set my loudest section at -7 or even 7.5, and I would be happy with that. And you can do it easily with the clip to 0 method. Now, I've talked about the framework sounds. I've talked about the anchor sounds. Yeah, here's the last thing. I'm just going to talk. I'm going to spend about another 10, 20 minutes talking about a few other odds and ends in this particular project to demonstrate some key mixing decisions that are important if your goal is a competitive loudness target. If you're working towards a loud master. These are things you have to think about for loudness in particular. So the first thing is there's 3 fears that every new producer has. There's things you're always afraid to do. And I'm going to encourage you to stop being afraid of that. The first fear is making your drums loud enough. Every new producer always de-emphasizes the drums. They emphasize the melodic things and the mid-bass sounds and their cool little aggressive drop sounds and whatever. And the drums are always way too buried. This was something my mentors had to hammer into me when I was first really getting my head around working in loud genres. Dylan, thank you so much. Dylan was merciless with me. Ill Gates, right? He would constantly say, "Yeah, that's good, but man, you need to make that kick and snare way louder," right? Because I was hesitant. I was afraid. Make your drums loud. They have to punch. They sit at the top of your mix. They are the pulse. People are dancing. They need to hear the backbeat. They need to hear the downbeat. They need to hear it loud and clear through all the crazy sounds you're doing, right? Make them loud. Make them way louder than you're comfortable with at first. Really pay attention when you listen to reference tracks and notice how freaking loud and sharp the kicks and snares often are. Listen to the reference tracks, make your kicks and snares just as loud, just as hot, just as dense. Okay, now that's not necessarily easy because a lot of kicks and a lot of snares you'll pick out of your sample pack will fall apart when you try and get them up to something like -10 max momentary. They'll just turn to mush. So there's a bit of an art to how to make a kick and snare loud. And I'll just say that's a journey and an adventure all in and of itself. But the trick is transient shapers and transient shapers and transient shapers. That's all I'm going to say for now. Maybe I'll do a video on that later. The other thing producers are afraid to do is make their subs loud enough. And that's largely because a lot of new producers don't have the right gear to hear their subs on, and their room is too small, and their speakers are too small, and they don't even have a subwoofer, or if they do have a subwoofer, it's not balanced against their monitors, and then their tiny room is screwing things up for them by creating these room modes so that literally you move your head 8 inches and the sub changes. And F is really loud in one position and a little quieter if you move your head to the side a foot. And then G is suddenly way quieter than F, and it's just crazy, right? Because you're in a tiny room and the room modes are just unforgiving. So one trick is to use good headphones with a good extended sub range and just listen for your subs on headphones. Another trick is to use meters to help you understand what's going on, like I was showing you with the oscilloscope and the spectrum analyzer. But honestly, truly, the best trick, invest in a transducer. Invest in a sub pack. Or they also make transducers for drummers, these little thumpers that you put in the bottom of your drum throne so that your butt is feeling the sub from the kick. That's what the drum transducers are made for. And the sub pack, you sit with your spine pressed up against it and it's blowing into your spine and the bottom part of your lungs. And trust me, they are worth their weight in gold. They will help you feel what your ears can't hear. They will help your room and even your headphones lie to you a lot less. If you want to get good at mixing your low end, get a sub pack or some kind of drum tone transducer and somehow rig it up to the bottom of your chair. Okay? Whatever it takes, get one. It will make such a difference because most of us don't have big fancy control rooms. And honestly, if you listen to engineers who are honest, most control rooms kind of suck too, even in studios, okay? They're still very biased. They still lie to you about the low end and other things. So you're just gonna have to muddle through there, but my main advice is you're usually afraid to make it loud enough. And so you think you're, in your room on your monitors with your room lying to you, you think the sub sounds perfect. And then you go in a car or you play it in some other place on some different system and it's like all of a sudden it's too boomy because your head was in a low pressure node when you mixed it. Or it's too wimpy because your head was in a high pressure node when you mixed it, right? So get something that doesn't lie to you about the subs and then also use my rule of thumb about oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers to also help you double check that those peaks are all hitting at roughly the same height for every pitch in the sub. You know, there isn't one pitch that's way lower than another, even in a spectrum analyzer, because phasing issues can cause that sometimes. There's a lot of nuance there. You're just gonna have to muddle through, but overall, make those subs loud. Really listen to the subs on your reference tracks and make your song have just as much energy. And it'll be so much easier for you to feel and hear that if you have something like a sub pack. Just trust me on that. I am never, ever uncertain about my subs and my low end because I have a sub pack. And that sub pack does not lie. I can totally tell when my kick is, the side chaining of my kick to my sub is too gappy or too overlappy. I can tell when pitches in my sub riff are uneven because of phasing that might be happening. And that helps me find and get rid of the phasing. I can tell when my sub isn't as heavy as the reference track I'm going for. It's just dirt obvious with a sub pack or any kind of transducer, so get one. That's all I can say about that. And then finally, the third thing producers tend to be really fearful about is making vocals, if you even dare to do vocals in your electronic dance music, making the vocals hot enough to sit on top and out front in the mix. Let me show you this vocal in isolation, just to give you a hint of what I'm talking about. Let's put it here.
I could ask a million questions that would leave me wanting more.
Remember how earlier I said this sounds like the singer's pressed up against the grill? And this is really hot and saturated? Guess what? Your vocals need to be like this. They need to sound almost unnaturally hot, unnaturally bright and sharp, and on the edge of shrillness to sit in a loud, hot mix. They just do, or they're going to be too wimpy. Want to hear what this original vocal sounded like? And it was a good recording, but the original vocal sounds a lot more like this. Let's see, I'm going to keep... Yeah, I'll even take the low roll off.
I could ask a million questions that would leave me wanting more.
All right, let's add the roll off for the sub frequencies.
I could ask a million questions.
Now let's add a little bit of vocal leveling. Power is great for that. Because it's got this whole leveler section that's really good, followed by a compressor section. It's really good if you don't want to have to hand edit your vocals and you're in a hurry, like I was for this. I didn't want to spend 2 hours hand editing the dynamics of the vocals.
I could ask a million questions.
See, this is a lot more even now, dynamics. And now here's the trick. Here's where I hotted up, the first stage of hotting up this sound.
I could ask a million questions.
But even that's not hot enough.
I could ask a million questions.
Hear the difference? Hear how I'm emphasizing this part of the mid-range a little more when I bring this thing online?
I could ask a million questions.
All the clarity in your vocals comes from the 2K range, 1 and 2K range.
I could ask a million questions.
So because I wanted the lyrics to be as audible as possible over a loud, dense mix, you got to emphasize even this important 1 and 2K range, right? And look at how much this particular processing changed the vocal.
I could ask a million. I could ask a million questions.
Much hotter, much thinner, much more mid-rangey, much more compressed and up in your face. So here's the trick. Vocal processing is really hard for newbies. And if I were to use lots of different processors, it takes a while to get to this space. I have to say Joey Sturgis Tones, JST, they made this thing and they did it right. This is the first all-in-one vocal processor I love. I do not like CLA vocals or any of that crap. well, I shouldn't say that. I don't like CLA vocals, right? From a certain vendor. I don't like any of those vocal things, but this one I was like, oh my God, JST got it right, because Joey Sturgis is a big fan of metal, and he makes a lot of plugins that are really geared towards the metal producers and engineers. And he understands that metal is harsh and has a whole lot of stuff competing with the vocals. And he understands what you need to do to make vocals stand out and sit on top of a really dense, shrill, mid-rangey metal mix, right? And you need some of those same things to stand out in front of a heavy EDM banger or, bass music banger, right? With all kinds of denseness and hotness, because they're kind of similar. They're both loudness more genres. So for whatever reason, he got Howard Benson to, kind of design Howard Benson's bespoke approach to this kind of vocal treatment in this one plugin that's just amazing. And all I can say is it's a little bit of a deep plugin, but it's actually pretty intuitive too. You don't have to understand everything going on here. They created a ton of videos for it. This is not paid promotion. I paid for this thing myself. It's fantastic for this type of music and for making a vocal hot enough to sit where it needs to in this type of music and give it that presence and density and whatever. So not too washed in the reverbs, pretty dense, pretty upfront. And then on top of that, I'm still adding saturate from the bottom. This is a parallel saturator. I've talked about it in other videos. My favorite saturator by far. It's like an EQ. It only ever boosts loudness in a given range, and it does it in a way that's so much better than EQ. It also reduces dynamic range because it pushes up the RMS more than it pushes up the peak. So it decreases the crest factor just a little bit. And you just use it like an EQ. It's like vocal isn't present enough in this area, vocal isn't present enough in this area. Let me give them little bumps. And you can even choose the type of saturation that it's using. There's a few different types of saturation you can choose from. And it's just wonderful. It's by Waves Factory called Spectre. So, again, with this on and off.
I could ask a million questions. I could ask a million.
Right? So don't be afraid to make your vocals loud and hot and kind of dry and out front. I don't have a lot of reverb on this. And in fact, this plugin won't even really let you put a lot of reverb on here. The space is kind of reverb, but it's also delay as much as it is reverb. This is kind of delay, this is kind of reverb, but kind of yes, kind of no. I don't know, it's hard to describe. It's really intelligently done, and it's hard to overdo the reverb, and it's hard to overdo the delay, and they just sound sweet and delicious. And then this is a great, nice sounding vocal multiplier, and this is a great way to push the mid-side balance out to the sides if you want it to bleed a little bit into the sides instead of staying straight down the middle like a laser beam. It's just great. Get it. So then the final thing I do is, because these processors are adding a lot of low end back into the mix, a lot of sub energy, I have to put another exact same curve, exact same place, just to cut out the sub rumble that some of these processes are adding back.
I could ask a million questions.
See how high that is right here? So you have to shave it off again so it's not fighting with the kick and the sub. Okay, so that's vocal processing. Get your vocals loud and hot. So the other thing, I still need to do a video of my template. Structured bussing is super important if you're going to work loud and you're going to work with clipper cascades. What I mean by structured bussing is this. This brown line, forget these two tracks. They're not in the mix at all. Everything ends up at my pre-master. And this brown line here shows everything that's rolling into the pre-master, which right now is 2 buses. All my drum sounds and all my not drum sounds, period. Because again, the drums need to stay out front. So I don't let them blend with tonal sounds until the very last minute when they finally have to combine together up on the pre-master. This keeps all these sounds from summing up on top of my drum transients and making it harder to control the balance between drums and tonal stuff. Also, there are a lot of places throughout my tonal buses where I'm doing heavy side chaining against the kick and the snare of the drums. And different sounds need different ducking shapes and timing. So we'll get into that in a second here. But the point is, I have this very structured busing. Keep your drums separate from your tonal stuff at first. And then even in my tonal group, I'm distinguishing between my sub-range, all my mid-range sounds, and my vocals, because vocals always need special treatment and they need to sit on top. So they all get different types of treatment. Subs have sub things inside of them, and only the sub, not the sub top, just the sub, because I don't want to clip or limit or change what's going on in the clean sub region very much. It's in the midline region, and it's actually what I call a melodic sound, is where I put my sub top. Let's talk about that sub for a second. I'm going to show you the sub alone in a spectrum analyzer. I soloed it, yeah. And I should go to a section where there is sub, right here. Okay. See all these harmonics? I am adding some harmonics to the sub itself. In this particular case, I'm using a tool called Subdivine, and I'm using one of its harmonic types here with just a very light amount of drive, just to get these harmonics here. But those harmonics, although they're giving the sub a little bit of an edge, it's not nearly, they're not high enough to be audible. They just give it a little bit of that richness to move the air in certain ways. Now, notice where the bulk of the subregion sits, down here, from this line at 200 hertz down. Now I'm going to bring in the sub top, and we're going to look at the sub top just by itself. I've got a little bit of energy below 200, but I've got a lot more, energy and loudness happening right in here in the low mids. And then if I combine that with the sub, see how now my harmonics effectively are sitting a lot higher? But this is a top layer. And it's this top layer that makes this same subline audible on crappy little tiny speakers that can't really reproduce sub at all. Your laptops, speakers, and your earbuds, and so on. And then down here is for the actual subwoofers and headphones and stuff that can reproduce sub. And it's one glued sound. But the main point I'm making here is because this sound is actually a pretty low mid-range sound. I want it to be controlled by my overall processing of mid-rangey melodic sounds, okay, in my mid-range bus. So within my midline, if I were to turn on some of the types of sounds I don't use, like I'm not using any drop sounds, aggressive mid-bass drop sounds in this track. I'm not using any lifters or risers, not using any atmospheric sounds. This is a very sparse, empty mix, very simple, not even a lot of detailing. I'm not using any Foley. So those tracks are normally part of my midline because they're all mid-rangey sounds. And I want them all controlled as one group, summing up into a single place in the midline where I can put final processing, EQ processing, and other things to adjust bad resonances that are summing up or whatever, right? And do my ducking to the group as a whole for the most part. Like, I don't have duckers on my individual buses here, and I don't have any duckers on my individual sounds. There's no kick or snare ducking happening here. I do all the ducking for all those mid-range sounds against the kick and the snare and even the vocals right here in one bus, okay? And let's talk about the Vox ducking. No, let's not talk about the Vox ducking. You also need to duck the mid-range against your vocals so they sit on top. Yeah, I will talk about it. This is one plugin that I didn't pay for, but this isn't promotional consideration. I genuinely endorse this plugin on my own. I used to use something called Track Spacer from Waves Factory to do this, but I've grown to like this one better because it's a little more surgical. This is Smart Comp. And ever since I said really nice things about Smart EQ once upon a time, because I bought that one myself, but I love it, Sonable started sending me advanced copies of some of their stuff in hopes that I might say nice things about it. So this isn't paid promotion. This is me genuinely endorsing this for myself. And I would have paid for this if it hadn't been handed to me first. I don't like this as a compressor because I don't like spectral compression or even spectral limiting. I don't even really like it in Elevate, although there's other things about Elevate that make Elevate good as a limiter. At least in Elevate, you can put back the sub-bass that spectral processing tends to rob to do compression or to do limiting. But a lot of them can't. And so I don't use it for compression. But what this is fantastic at is if you put it in sidechain mode, and if the sidechain for this is the, let's go to my my midline track. The sidechain for my Vox ducker here is coming from the vocal bus. This is my vocals coming into the midline bus. And my vocals are the sidechain trigger. And it's in a spectral ducking mode. And so what it looks like is this. I should probably put the whole track back on. And let's make sure, yeah, I'm in a vocal section.
I do my best to learn to listen.
See this? This is exactly where the vocal peaks are masking or competing with all the other mid-range sounds, my electronic road sound in this example, my EP sound. And so it's using, really, really, really granular FFT bends to just push down everything in my mid frequency bus. It's pushing everything down when the vocals are present in that one instantaneous moment. And it's doing it to different depths. The brighter dashes are more pushing and the dimmer dashes are less pushing. And it's doing it very surgically.
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you have so much.
Now let me bypass this and look at the difference.
I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen.
Listen to the difference between this and the EP sound in the background.
I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen.
It just helps the vocals. It's very subtle. I'm not overdoing it. Don't ever overdo this when you do it. Like my ratio here is pretty small. And it's, it's really gentle ratio. And the threshold is this, by dragging this bar up and down, you control the ratio. This bar controls where it starts doing its number. And you'll figure it out by feel. But be gentle with it. Don't overdo it. And it's just enough to help the vocals sit on top a lot more, especially if you got a really dense, busy mix with a lot of things going on in the mid-range. So I do recommend this, and that's super useful for vocal processing in loud genres. Okay, so with the structured busing, you see that it's giving me this kind of control over where and how things are ducked, where and how things are EQ'd. It's always better to do processing on a group of sounds than to do it on each individual sound. Like, reverb on a group of related sounds is going to sound way better than 3 different reverbs on 3 different sounds. It's just going to sound more cohesive, more natural. It's the same for ducking. It's the same for a lot of things. So the other thing that structured busing lets me do is increase the granularity of my clipping cascade. Again, you want to, if a certain specific sound isn't loud enough all by itself to fit into the mix, you might have to saturate it from the bottom to get it a little louder, and then clip it from the top to reduce its dynamic range even more, so you can push the whole RMS up, right up so the peak hits 0, so that it's now loud enough to fit into your mix. So you might have to clip an individual sound, but you also need to clip at every bus where multiple sounds come together in sum. And by doing lots of little microscopic clips across your entire cascade as tracks roll up towards the premaster and sum together on their way up to the premaster, doing lots of smaller clips that way will always sound cleaner and better than if you try and do one huge clip on the master. And I've pointed at videos before where a friend of mine named Framinator has explained this principle very well. I talk about it in this particular video if you want to go see the description of it, and in some other earlier videos. But go here and you'll see some link to where I show. Here's Framinator explaining why you clip many places, right? There's a theory behind it. It's a 5-minute video. Go check it out. I think there's even a link in the description. Let's see. That they call. Did I put it in the description? Yeah, right here. You can just go straight to it with this link in the description on this video. Go watch it. It's really super interesting. What else? Surgical side chaining. And I do mean surgical, okay? Here's my sub bus where I'm ducking the sub to the kick. And here's the shape of the ducking slice and the position of the ducking slice. Over here on my midline bus, I've got another kick ducker. And you see that the slice is shorter and differently shaped. They're both ducking to the kick, but they're ducking in different ways. And I cannot emphasize enough, don't use a compressor to duck. You have no control over the length and shape of the duck. And that's just not going to cut the mustard. Let's show you. I think I can show it to you the best with the sub. We're going to do the kick, snare, and sub alone. And let's go ahead and add in the sub top so you hear that clearly. So sub top, sub. Let's get the drums open, and let's get the kick and the snare soloed in here. All right. And then we're going to bring up the oscilloscope, because this is how you really see the problem. All right, here's my individual kick, sub, and snare. You can see this big gap in the sub. There's my side chain happening right here for the kick. Back to the layers. Now, what you want is you want this slice and the crossover between the sub finally coming up and the kick going down. That's the shape here. You want that slice to basically make it so that when those signals are summed together, the kick doesn't change and the sub doesn't change. Let me show it to you. In this oscilloscope, it's great because I can look at it in a layered way, or I can say, show me the sum of all these signals. Let me see how this little wiggle of sub right here is adding into the snare. Let me see how this little purple overlap of sub with the last little tail portion of the kick, how are they summing up, and what are they doing when they phase together and create phase interference? Boom. That's the subbed signal. And you'll notice it doesn't look that much different. Sub looks pretty much the same. Kick, these 2 peaks, those 3 peaks look about the same. Boom, 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 boom. kick is untouched. It's not being interfered with by the sub, and vice versa. Now watch what happens if I change this ducking slice even a little bit. I'm going to make it a little shorter and a little longer. And watch what happens, especially to the kick and where it starts interacting with the lowest little bits of energy from the sub right here. Check this out. See that sudden peak right there on the last little waveform of the kick body? It's now way above zero. That's the zero line. This white line here is zero. It's way above it. Check it out. I have suddenly made my kick body have a peak way the hell above zero, and here too at the bottom, and a clipper or limiter is going to have to hammer that down to zero again, and that's going to flub out the kick. It's going to make it rubbery and dead and mushy sounding. It's going to really soften up the kick, especially if it gets worse. Check it out. This is what trying to duck with a compressor does. You have no control, no fine control. And so when you think you're sidechaining your kick against your sub, you're creating horrible interactions like this. And then the limiter or clipper or whatever is going to just crunch your kick and kill it. And this is what's wrong with compressor clipping. Use a surgical ducker, like Duck by Devious Machines. It's my favorite. And so if I make it longer, now we have a gap. Now we've got phase interference, and you hear this audible boing between the ka-koom, ka-koom, right? There's going to be a boing in here. I'll make it even worse so you can really hear it. Boing. You don't want that either. You want it to be a smooth crossfade. And so just changing this distance here, or even if it's in roughly the right spot like this, see? Kick looks the same as before, sub looks the same as before. Kick doesn't change, sub doesn't change. If I change the slope or the shape of the slice, it's going to change again. Watch. And again, I'm changing the way my whole kick is shaped because of phase interference between even a tiny little bit of sub versus the kick. So you have to get your ducking surgical, especially for your two most important low-end framework sounds. So you need to play with the distance and the shape and just get this looking so the kick doesn't change and the sub doesn't change. Kick never moves. Kick never budges. Kick is untouched. Okay? Got to do that. Now, you can't always get away with that on your higher mid-range sounds with the kick, because if you put too much of a gap between the kick and the mid-range sounds, you'll hear the pump. So that's why you duck your mid-range sounds very differently. Here, if I bring up SciScope again, and we turn off the subs and we say, show me everything in the mid-range. And let's go to the layers. Well, I don't have much mid-range here. Let's go to the song section where we have more mid-range happening. Okay. Oh. And of course, I need to solo the right things too. Let's take the sub out, kick, snare, and just everything in the midline. Okay, here we go. So this dark blue line is all the mid-range sounds, and you see there's very little ducking happening, especially on the kick. This is the ducking slice. If I zoom in here, you can see it a little better. All I'm ducking for the kick portion is the short transient of the kick, and this this body of the kick, I pretty much let these sounds come in full blown. But here's the deal. This is a low frequency sound for the kick. This is a high frequency sound for the mid-range. See how the jaggies are much closer together? So if you have spectrally slotted your mid-range sounds so that they're not even happening in the mid-range, there won't be any important phase interference here. It won't change the nature of your kick. There may still be a little bit of summing, but you'll reduce the summing on your kick if, where do I do it in my midline? I did it individually per sound. So let's take, for example, the ARP line. You know, in the ARP line, I've got some spectral slotting, some mid-range slotting that's keeping it mostly out of the kick area down here. It's going to still sum up a little bit in this range, right? So we are going to see a little bit of summing, and you can't entirely get rid of that. Here we go. I'm going to go to sum mode. So the kick is changing its energy and peak on the subby tail of the kick right here a little bit, but not that much, and in a way that when a clipper or limiter hits it, it's going to be not squashing the actual sub portion of the kick that much. It's hard to describe. You're just going to have to puzzle through it, but you can't completely override this, but you still want to put some side chaining in here, and you just want to do it by ear. How much slope and how far it should be. Just listen for if you're hearing too much gappy pumping, then you've pushed it too far and you need to pull it back this way. And again, if you frequency slot so that it's just high frequency sounds that are summing with the lower subby portion of the kick, the overall effect isn't going to be so bad, and clippers or limiters aren't going to hurt the kick when it does take those few peaks and knocks them back off at zero. It's mostly going to change the shape of the kick so that it still looks like a kick and a sine wave, but the little wiggles on top of the sine wave will be smaller and shorter. It's going to actually really mostly just clip the high frequencies. The kick underneath is unchanged. And it's especially unchanged because of my gainstaging structure. My busing structure that keeps the drums entirely separate from all the tonal mid-range sounds until the very last moment. So I guess that's the best thing I can say about that. Now, mid-range slotting, as I pointed out in earlier videos, is super important. The rules of thumb, and again, go back to this video to see a lot more detailed description about this. There's some areas in here where I talk about it, I think. As a general rule, on every kind of mid-rangey sound you have, whether it's my sub top or my sort of sawtoothy ARP line or my glitchy guitarish faux guitar tweaky top, every one of these has this kind of shape on it. This is another thing I'm very thankful to Bill Gates for teaching me. These three sounds at one point all happen together. And I want you to notice they all live, I'm constraining them to be focused in different parts of the mid-range from each other. This kind of electric piano, the subtop is focused in the lowest of the low mid-range, right? This ARP line is a little broader, but I'm rolling off some of its fundamental energy here and letting it focus in this region here. And then this glitchy guitar part that happens later in the song, I'm hiding a lot of its lower mid-range stuff and letting it mostly occupy this slightly higher end of the mid-range. And so it's important to roll off the sub area, usually with a fairly gentle 12 dB slope. Don't overdo it, although I did break the rule on the sub top because I really wanted this to, yeah, I don't want to go there. For my subtops, I'll get a lot sharper with the slope. For every other mid-range sound, I use a gentle 12 dB slope so that I don't overdo phase issues too much and create peaks higher than they need to be, because low pass and high pass filters always create slightly higher peaks. It's just the nature of digital physics and signal processing. The point is, get your low end out of there. I'm sorry, David Nazi. There is a reason for some low pass madness. I mitigate it by using very gentle filters, not really steep filters. And then it's really important. This super high area of your spectrum can get cluttered really, really fast if you let all your mid-range sounds build up in the super high range above 7K and above. So almost every melodic mid-range sound or aggressive dubsteppy mid-bass type sound for a drop, I set a filter right around 7K, 12 dB, gentle slope, and I get this energy out of here because the only thing that should live up here are your drum tops, your hi-hats and cymbals and stuff and shakers, and the snap of your snare and the snap of your kick, and maybe arguably the air of your vocals. Leave this, don't let things build up here, because this is where you get a lot of harshness and you also get a lot of extra energy that your limiters react to and your clippers react to, and then they're too aggressive. So just mid-range sounds live in the mid-range. So make them live in the mid-range. Taper this stuff off on either side. And then if you have several different mid-rangey sounds all happening at the same moment, try to avoid that as much as possible for loud music. But when you do have to layer them, give them each their own part of the mid-range to live in. Okay, and let the kick and subs and the fat body of the snare live down here, and let your drum air and cymbals live up here, and maybe your vocal air live up here. And boy, that will give you so much room in your mix already. Now, the other thing that's important is mid-side positioning and depth. So that's probably best exemplified on my chordal EP sound. I'm using my favorite mid-side tool, which is called Stage 1 by Leapwing. What I love about this is I don't have to think much, and they put everything in one place, and they built it really well and gave a lot of careful thought to it. This width section is just mid-side balance, and also letting you center where how far down into the subregion you are letting this mid-side spread roll into. Like if you want to keep a really laser-focused tight bottom end, you might push this up higher. If you want to go ahead and let a lot of your perception of width actually happens around 100 hertz, 200 hertz. So if you go too far above 200, you actually make it harder to make a sound feel wide. So you kind of have to play in this range here and just find the balance where it's working for you. I had it around here. And then the mono spread is a unique thing they add to the equation. It's literally taking the phantom center and pulling it completely out of the center. And so this is a way to even further pull clutter out of the exact middle center of your mix. And this is an electric piano. I want it to be out to the sides. I don't want it competing with the vocals in the center. So I used a little mono spread to pull it even further away from just the center itself, not just the mid-side depth push. And then this depth section is actually like a combination of delay, mostly delay, maybe a little bit of reverb, and they're using time domain effects to subtly push the sound into the background through time domain blurring, okay? And you can change the coloration of the blurring here. So the net effect is really important. Listen to this, this drop section and how much clarity it adds to everything. Not the drop section, the verse section. So we're gonna go back to the verse. And we're going to come back here to my wash EP. And what I'm going to do is, well, I can just do it here. I'm going to toggle stage 1 on and off. Here's with it on. I need to get every sound back in there.
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you have.
Now when I turn this off,
I do my best to learn to listen.
Hear how now it's fighting with the vocals? It's fighting in the center. For the vocals, it's also fighting with the snare and the kick a little bit. And even the sub. Everything's muddy now. Everything's fighting with each other. I'm going to toggle it on and off a little faster so you can hear the difference.
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you have so much to say, if I connect with your
So the thing that's great about stage one is it's hard to get in trouble with it. It's gentle enough that you can't overdo it easily. So I don't know. Get different mid-side EQ things, play with it, do it manually the hard way, or get an all-in-one kind of plugin like this. It can help you with that. But you want to push sounds that you need to give every sound its own space in the left-right sound stage and also the front-to-back sound stage to improve the clarity and perception of every sound in the mix. And I'm even doing some tricks with stage one, like I want the electric piano to be more in the center and more up front during the mix in and mix out sections. So I literally take away this depth control. I have some automation here that turns the depth off and pushes it right to the front. But then as soon as everything else comes in, I kick this back on to push it into the background slightly, as well as, you know, the other things that are happening with it. So that's a kind of automation you can play with. And boy, that is finally everything. If you've hung with me this whole time, you're a trooper and you've probably learned a lot. And I hope this has been helpful. I'll see you soon.